This is not taught in your public schools, although it will be. The history that the children are learning today is not going to be the history that's going to be taught in the next 25 years.
People make certain assumptions that Africans can't be elites, and they certainly can't be elites anywhere outside of Africa, and they could have never ruled over non-Africans. And if there were in fact Africans who did do this, they were in fact North Africans and not East Africans from places which today are places like Somalia, Ethiopia, and so on. But this is not completely true. In this surrender scene of the Sultan of Gujarat to the Mughal emperor in the 16th century, in a slightly later painting, one sees two Africans clearly in the elite surrendering. And there were many such Africans. There are all sorts of legends about Africans. In this epic about the Prophet Muhammad's uncle, there are legendary Africans called the Zangis. And here are the Zangis. You can see the king of the Zangis and all of his minions. And they're wearing these curious fur hats, with most of which are red. And I'm going to show you similar hats because that became the symbol in India of Africans. If you see somebody wearing such a hat, you know they're an African.
Missionaries had told us as children that the only light came to Africa with white people. That before the white men came, we black people had no idea about God. We had no belief in a life after death, and that our people were just a race of savages who used to lie around in the sun, womanize, fight, and drink beer every day. I was suddenly awakened to the fact that Africans had in fact been far greater intellectually than the missionaries were willing to give them credit for. That like the white men, we had astrology, astronomy, we had surgery. In fact, I found that Zulu surgeons in the early years of the 19th century and the 18th century and even beyond could perform operations which white surgeons were not capable of operating.
Human history is something many people take for granted. We grow up assuming the version taught in schools is the truth, a complete and accurate account of our collective past. But when you begin to look beyond the surface, it becomes clear that much of what we've been taught is either distorted, incomplete, or an actual lie. Entire civilizations have been erased from memory, their contributions downplayed or rewritten to serve political, economic, and ideological agendas. One of the clearest examples of this is seen through the lens of African history during the era of colonization. For colonizers to justify the enslavement and exploitation of African people, they first had to strip them of their identity, erasing their rich histories, suppressing their cultures, and portraying them as primitive or inferior. This strategic manipulation of history wasn't just about conquest, it was about control. Because to dominate a people, you must first sever their connection to who they are and where they come from.
When the white man started destroying our religion, when he started demonizing our gods, when he started ridiculing what we believed in and actually using educated Africans to destroy that ancient African religion, in many parts of Africa, say, our ancient religion went underground. And there were, call them secret societies, all over South Africa and Central Africa and East Africa and West Africa, where this knowledge was stored. and kept by aging guardians, many of whom did not know that in other parts of the land there were other guardians who were doing exactly as they were doing. Now, when I first became a Sangoma, I was already, say, a person of education. I had entered school as a child of 14 years, and when I became a Sangoma, I was a youth of 16 years. And what my aunt and my grandfather, as well as my maternal grandmother, taught me, shook me to the core of my soul. I found that the mission schools had been teaching me lies about my people all along. Missionaries had told us as children that the only light came to Africa with white people, that before the white men came, we black people had no idea about God. We had no belief in a life after death, and that our people were just a race of savages who used to lie around in the sun, womanize, fight, and drink beer every day. I was suddenly awakened to the fact that Africans had in fact been far greater intellectually than the missionaries were willing to give them credit for. That, like the white men, we had astrology, astronomy, we had surgery. In fact, I found that Zulu surgeons in the early years of the 19th century and the 18th century and even beyond could perform operations which white surgeons were not capable of operating. And the more I learned about my people, sir, the more I wanted to learn.
Just over 100 years ago, a wandering prospector, a German by origin called Karl Mauch, searching for gold, came through these remote hills on a long trail and stumbled on this. He was the first white man ever to see it. And what he'd found, though he didn't know, were the largest man-made structures in any part of old Africa south of the valley of the Nile. What were these mysterious ruins found so unexpectedly in the far interior of Africa? About the ancient history of the black peoples, nothing was remembered in the outside world or even known. Today, at last, we're beginning to learn. We know now that these great buildings stood at the heart of a powerful black kingdom.
It is very important to realize that Africa is an exploded star, a shattered diamond, and that its pieces have to be followed in all the continents. You cannot have a sense of what was essentially African just by going into Africa. You have to look into Europe, into Asia, into America.
A new discovery which has not yet been published. But before I tell you about that, people will say, well, big deal, so what? Why is history important at all? History is extremely important. Imagine if I could take from each one of you as an individual everything you knew about your life up to last week and just erase it. Where would you be? You'd be lost. You'd be incompetent. You wouldn't know how to plan for the future. And you do the same thing with a people. If you erase their history or you don't tell enough about their past, they also become incompetent and they can't fulfill the future. And that's why a lot of people in the black community have felt, well, how come all of the dreams of the civil rights movement aren't yet fulfilled? And one reason is because this history is still suppressed. It still isn't taught, but there's been a recent discovery which is going to blow the lid off of all that, and that's what I'm going to talk about. Now, basically, what science has now found, although this is suppressed for the most part, there have been some great researchers. You have some wonderful books there, like by Ivan van Sertima, who's talking about these things. This is not taught in your public schools, although it will be. The history that the children are learning today is not going to be the history that's going to be taught in the next 25 years. It's going to be radically different. We now know for a fact that long before Columbus, there were 4 major migrations of blacks to the Americas, different parts of the Americas, for totally different reasons, totally separated from each other by many centuries, but nonetheless there were these black, you can call them migrations, but they were not entirely. I'll describe, and you can make up your own mind what they were. The most recent of these took place about 400 years before Columbus was even born, and it's all outlined in a marvelous book over there. It's called The Golden Trade of the Moors. And it is now known that the West African kingdom of Mali had huge fleets of merchant vessels, and that these kings, these black kings of West Africa, began sailing across the Atlantic to Mexico as early as 900 AD. Now, why did they do that? They did that for trade, not for conquest or invasion. They did this for trade. Mali was very wealthy in gold. They had lots of minerals. Some of the black kingdoms, they were called the Yoruba or the Benin. They were great workers in bronze. But the trouble with West Africa, and it's still a trouble today, not enough food, famine. Somehow, the black kings of Mali had preserved this tradition of long before, where there was this kingdom across the sea, a totally different one. It was very hard to reach. You needed to have excellent ships and good sailors, and nobody in Europe was doing it at this time. But if you cross that sea, this other kingdom across the Atlantic was very rich in a certain kind of food, which the people over there called maize. We now call corn. And these West African kings launched at least 2 major fleets, trading ventures, that went across the Atlantic 900 AD to about 1600 AD. And they brought over their bronze work, and they taught the Mexican people, the ancient Mexican people, who were then known as the Mayas. The Mayas had built up a great kingdom of their own, but in 900 AD they were in decline. They were really on the outs. Nobody knows exactly why, but their society was in decline. They were losing all of their technology. Then these black fleets came across from West Africa, from Mali, and they presented a lot of gold work, bronze work, and in return they came back with shiploads of corn, maize. Now we know for sure that this actually happened because very recently, you'll see in the next issue of our magazine, not this issue, the next issue is coming out in about 2 weeks. This is part of the discoveries are happening so fast and furious it's hard to keep track. They now have found that a certain type of maize or corn which is growing in West Africa, has been growing there for many centuries, is not native to West Africa. It is a type of corn which comes from Mexico. Could have only been brought over by these Mali seafarers over 1,000 years ago. So this is a first concrete proof that they beat Columbus by centuries, and were not just on a voyage of exploration. They were going back and forth, bringing corn back. Now, why do we know about that? Well, this trade stopped abruptly 1600 AD. 1600 AD, the Spanish, the Portuguese were on a real aggressive colonizing campaign, and they took over Africa, and they destroyed a lot of these kingdoms. And with the destruction of these kingdoms went all the knowledge and all the history of these past trades. This is a tremendous lesson for us because, you know, we're so proud of our American civilization. We think it'll go on forever. But when a civilization falls, history tells us it takes almost all memory of it with it. Civilization is really very fragile. And that's why these lessons from the past are very, very important. If we want to preserve our civilization, we have to learn what happened to these others that crashed. So we know for sure between 900 and 1600 AD, long before Columbus was even born, as I say, these blacks were trading, these black kingdoms were trading with Mexico. This is something I hadn't got time to go into because it's so long, but it's really interesting. This is a drawing from life that was made, believe it or not, of a so-called American Indian, the southern coast of California. He was a member of the Chumash, no longer exist. When the Spaniards met up with these people, they said, these are civilized Indians. They got along extremely well with them. The reason why they got wiped out, though, was because they had no immunity to the diseases that the Spaniards brought over. And so they were all wiped out. This is the last of them, about the mid of the early 19th century. They were a black people who built fantastic boats. They were like Viking boats, believe it or not. They were lab-straked, over one plank over the other, so they were very resilient in the water. They had a tradition that they did not originate in America. They came from this great island out across the Pacific, and they lived in a number of islands off of California. One of them was Santa Barbara. You've heard that, Santa Barbara. And they called Santa Barbara Limu. That was their name for it. So this man, probably the last of the Chumash, one of the last of the Chumash, represents one of these people from Mu, the very early times. These are representations from Ivan Van Sertima's book. You've got one of them here. It's excellent. These are one of the Olmec heads. This is one of the figurines that are found throughout Mexico. What's interesting is that these people are never portrayed as servile or slavish. They're always portrayed as prosperous, as bringing things, bringing metals.
I have been associated for a long time with the American thesis, the establishment of an African presence in early America. But that is just a part, it's just one part of the whole story. What we are trying to achieve is a synthesis of the African presence all over the world. The African presence in Europe, which I'm dealing with tonight, is tremendously important, just as important as the African presence in early America. Because it really begins at the very beginning. Because there are no Europeans on this planet until about 55 to 50,000 years ago, whereas there are Africans going back 3 million years. You have all heard of Lucy. Lucy goes back 3.5 million years, but Lucy, found in Ethiopia, is not really a complete human being. It's what is known as a hominid, but it does not have the brain size of modern man. Okay, so the mere fact that man was born in Africa is in itself not important. I want you to note that what we have discovered over the last 5 years is far more important. We have not simply discovered that man was born in Africa. What has been discovered recently is that the last man was born in Africa, and that all human beings now on this earth are anatomically African. In other words, the brain, an organism that we all occupy, is African, whatever the skin color, etc.
There are many people who claim that it's an impossible and baseless theory. So these people who claim that the out-of-Africa migration theory is false seem to not be well educated on the matter, especially since it wasn't just one out-of-Africa migration that occurred in ancient times, but there were multiple migrations that occurred over time.
For the discoveries of the last few years that have made an impact is only possible because of the fact that it is coming from the very best universities. One of them, Oxford, which is an extremely conservative university, is the first to come out to announce, after study of mitochondrial DNA, the first to announce that there is no doubt that the founding population of the modern world was African. That is very important because man being born in Africa is not the same thing. Because man could have been born in Africa, and it was argued he went out into Europe at a low-level stage, which he did, Homo erectus, not a proper, complete man, and then came Neanderthal man, and then came Grimaldi man. But what they find is that all of these stages of man are African. Every one. Africa is the only place that has the complete sequence of all the stages of man. So it is not only the first incomplete or extremely primitive, low-level brain man that is born there, but the highest form of man, modern man, was born there. So you see all the stages The first three stages died out, the last three stages moved into Europe, Asia, and the rest of Africa, and then they died out until eventually Africa produced the complete man, which is the man we have today, modern man. They find that man in Africa about 100 to 140,000 years ago. So even though we found Lucy 3.5 million years ago, Lucy is not modern man. Okay, modern man only goes back about 140,000. Some people put it at 200,000. What has also been established by Rebecca Kahn is that all the creatures now on this planet can be traced to one black woman who lived about 150,000 years ago. They have been able to do this with great precision because the instruments we have now, the way we can go into the blood and find out the history of man, we know that only the black has all the genes. So they can find out at what point you have these variations and mutations. Now, how did it happen? In the sense that how did the Europeans happen? How did they come into being? The African, as I say, occupied Europe. There are no Europeans in Europe about 50 to 55,000 years ago. The African peoples the whole world. However, the final man, Grimaldi man, is caught in Europe. He's caught in a certain ice circle. There's a period known as the worm interstadial, and he's caught in the ice. There are parts of Europe that are covered by ice 1/2 mile thick. The African in that area, wherever he produces the albino, and the African produces pink people, even without mixtures, the Africa produces a pink type occasionally. That pink type is usually a type that dies easily, because if you produce an albino in Africa, he would suffer from devastating skin cancers. However, the albino that the African produced in Europe became a selected type because in the darkness of Europe, the twilight of Europe, the ice of Europe, where you did not have the direct and intense sunlight, the albino or albino type began to survive and to be selected. So that after a while, you find a number of pink-skinned Africans with African morphology, that is the nose, mouth, the jaw remaining the same, but only the skin changing. And of course, whenever there is skin color change, pigmentation change, you also have eye color change, hair color change. That change was necessary in some places because the ice made it impossible. The situation in ice Europe, not present Europe, not temperate zones, but the ice situation created a serious problem. It created a serious problem because pigmentation does not allow for all the light in twilight zones to come into the skin. Now, sometimes this could be the vitamin D deficiency that may result can be remedied by fishing. Like you find in certain zones where there's a lot of fish, you may still find fairly dark types like the Eskimo. Of course, there are other reasons for the Eskimo still retaining, in many cases, a dark color even though he's in the ice. But you find these changes going on. And then you find in Asia, as the African moves into Asia, you find in some parts the epicantic fold, the fold coming across the eye, like in the Japanese, some of the Chinese, etc. Because this becomes necessary as you move against certain kinds of winds on the steppes. So man's morphology, that is, man's superficial face, has nothing to do with his brain or his internal organism. That is just a cover. In other words, man's cover varies, but man's internality, man's internal organism, his brain, does not vary. And that internal organism, that brain, and that thing that is covered by the skin is African, because all the stages were African.